Buster Olney, thanks to Buffalo Wild Wings every Thursday evening around 5:15. Of course, we had the Yankees game earlier today. And Buster, explain yourself, man, because yesterday on your podcast, you mentioned two names that happen to be two really good closers and said that you would be shocked if the Yankees weren't able to acquire one of them. What the what? That got our attention.
Yeah, Aroldis Chapman or Craig Kimbrell, who are out on the market in what is a pretty flush market for closers. But, the Yankees are in a great position right now because there's not really something that they're dying to have. Their rotation is actually pretty deep. We've seen their bullpen is pretty deep. Their lineup has been shockingly healthy. And so they're in a great spot, sitting here waiting to see if some team trying to decide that they want to dump a contract or, maybe they want to get a prospect. They've got prospects to deal. They've got money to spend. And look, I think some dominoes have to happen before they could get a Craig Kimbrell. That would be if San Diego, which is trying to move some salary to prepare for 2016, decides, you know what, we need to get Kimbrell's contract out of here. He's owed over $30 million for the next 3 years. There are very few teams that would consider taking on a salary like that, and it would have to be a near salary dump where they tell the Yankees, we don't need a big prospect in return. And I suspect that the Yankees would be more aggressive in the talks with the Reds about Chapman. They're one of the teams that is picked around on that conversation. I think Chapman's going to get traded before the deadline. And, the Yankees might be willing to build something around Gary Sanchez, their young catcher, or somebody else. Because the one thing we've seen this year, the Yankees have certainly subscribed to the theory that was sort of demonstrated by Kansas City last year that you can really win with a dominant bullpen. The Yankees have their own experience with that from the 90s. And I was talking with a Red Sox player earlier in the week, and I mentioned to him, I said, I just get the feeling the Yankees are lying in the weeds for either Kimbrell or Chapman, and he just looked at me and he started to say, get the out of here. Like, I don't want to hear that. You're talking about Betances? You're talking about Miller, Kimbrell, Chapman? What? So I think they're in a great spot, and I think that's an area they're looking at.
It's an embarrassment of an abundance of riches for sure if they're able to do that with Betances and Miller playing so well. How does that change the role of Betances and Miller if they do bring in Chapman or Kimbrell?
It's a natural and interesting question in a lot of cases, and the Yankees invented the closer controversy with Goose Gossage and Sparky Lyle back in the day. But I know from my conversations with Andrew Miller, his attitude toward that whole thing of who's the closer, he meets with basically a big shrug of the shoulders as if to say, you know what, I got paid. I'm not worried about that. He really doesn't care. And Betances is a young pitcher who's not the closer now, and, there probably will be a time in his career where he would like to have that responsibility because there's often money attached to it. But for now, I really don't think they would have any issue if, they were to bring someone like a Chapman in and he strolled into the clubhouse. I think Andrew Miller would be the first guy to shake his hand and say, hey, welcome aboard. I'll take the 8th inning or I'll take the 7th inning, whatever Girardi needs.
Buster Olney, thanks to Buffalo Wild Wings with Armen Levack on 104.5 The Team. You mentioned a minor league catcher. Names like Judge, Severino, Ref Snyder. Are the Yankees willing to separate with any of those guys?
I think they essentially have three guys off they're not going to want to trade. Severino would be number one. I think Judge is number two, and I think Bird is number three, first baseman. We'll see. I suspect that if you start to bring in an elite talent like a Chapman into the conversation, maybe they get more flexible. I don't think they will with Severino. I think that he's here to stay. But I think below that, other guys, I think they definitely would talk about.
How much more of a serious contender are the Yankees if they add Chapman, for example?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I actually think that, look, they're rolling now, and they're playing really well, and they've got, a lot of things going. And so I don't think it necessarily would make a difference in the regular season, but I think it would make a lot of difference in the postseason because we've just seen in October that you win with bench and bullpen, and I think that would be the Yankees' big advantage over every team other than the Royals.
You mentioned there's not a glaring hole. What about second base, the need for a guy that can hit the baseball?
Yeah, and I think they'll be having conversations with Oakland about Ben Zobrist. But keep in mind, they're one of about 10 teams talking with Oakland about Ben Zobrist. Oakland's going to get a great return in whatever deal they make. But, they're talking to the Dodgers. They're talking to the Cubs. They're talking to the Mets. So I think that while, yes, the Yankees would be interested in his Zobrist deal, I think it's long, they probably is a long shot just because of the competition involved. It's a starting, in the market for starting pitchers and for relief pitchers, it really is a buyer's market because there's such a volume. But when it comes to second base, it's much more of a seller's market, and I'm not sure the Yankees will ante up on that.
Got it. You mentioned the Yankees are hot right now as they are, and there's just a feeling that this team is feeling it. Is there a chance that they can run away from the Orioles in this division that throughout the year we've talked about how close the AL East is going to be till the end?
They're playing great, and we saw that happen last year with the Orioles, where they ran away. We'll see. I guess, as always, the question that hovers over this team is whether or not they can stay healthy. And to this point, they've been able to run out Alex Rodriguez and Mark Teixeira and Brian McCann and a lot of the older guys essentially without a blip other than very minor stuff. And I think that if you compare what has happened to what we thought would happen and how injuries would be a factor, they've actually done pretty well other than the Ellsbury injury.
Buster Olney thanks to Buffalo Wild Wings. Buster, should Brett Gardner be named the captain of this team?
No. Look, he is. I think he's a terrific, he's a great guy, and he's someone who is absolutely the same as he was when he first broke in the big leagues. He's a terrific leader, but I never really saw the need, especially in baseball. And I think in hockey, it's a title that holds a special honor. But in baseball, I don't really get it. And for example, for years, and I covered John Franco, and he was a terrific reliever, but he was like the captain of the Mets, which just seemed the silliest thing in the world to me. Just having been around a lot of teams where position players are sort of in their own galaxy, then starting pitchers and relievers are sort of distinct and separate. And, when John Franco wasn't the closer, didn't have a big role on the Mets, it just felt weird that he had that role. And let's face it, in recent years, as Derek Jeter began to wane as a player, it always sort of felt weird that he was the captain. And that's why I think in some respects, unless it's an extraordinary person who you are absolutely convinced that throughout his run with the team is always going to handle everything perfectly, it's probably better just not to name it, because the question becomes, when that player stops being a great player, is that really a position you want them to be in? In a lot of cases, and I saw a lot of players with this, they get more difficult as they get older.
It's kind of weird, too, to have his name with Mattingly, Guidry, Gehrig, Ruth, Gardner. Does that really fit?
Well, I don't think of it quite that way. I think the idea, quite frankly, I think the idea of a captain in baseball is stupid.
Cool.
I just knowing players and having covered teams for years and knowing how different it is in terms of its culture than other sports, because it really is kind of a one-on-one game. You get the pitcher against the batter, and I don't think that having someone with a C on their jersey, whether it's theoretical or an actual C, it just doesn't fit the sport. And I can tell you this, privately, a lot of players think it's stupid, but just no one wants to say it out loud because they don't want to insult guys who are actually named captains.
Telling it how it is. Buster Olney thanks to Buffalo Wild Wings every Thursday with Armen and Levack. And Buster, you have great columns every day at ESPN.com. And just a few hours ago, you posted your latest about the New York Mets and their options. Any new hope that they're going to get something done before the trade deadline?
No. We have no indication that they are actually going to spend money of any significance and get, a major player. Now, they have asked around. They did have conversations with Oakland about Ben Zobrist, but they weren't willing to give up nearly close to what Oakland was looking for. So those conversations, at least as of last night, were dormant. I am curious to see if they even take on low-rent guys who are inexpensive. Lonnie Chisenhall, for example, was sent to the minor leagues by the Indians earlier this year. He was a third baseman. He's a left-handed hitter. He probably could help them in a platoon-type role. But the question is, are the Mets even capable of taking on $900,000 that he's owed? Are they able to take on extra guys? And look, you'd love for them to go get someone like a Justin Upton or a Zobrist who's more expensive. But I think that if you're the Mets, or if you're the Mets fans, you're kind of at the point where you just want to get some representative extra guys, because you saw the National Series in the third game play out where it was an extra guy, Michael Taylor, who got the game-tying hit. It was an extra guy, Danny Espinosa, who got the hit that gave the Nationals the lead. And that, to me, is the difference between those two teams. I mean, the Nationals and the Mets aren't that different. They've had a lot of injuries in Washington. They have a dominant pitching staff. Their run scoring is inconsistent, but they're just a deeper team, and that's something that the Mets should have been spending on the last 2 months, and they just haven't. And you look around at all the contenders, roster to roster, and you see how teams have made additions during the year, inexpensive additions, and the Mets aren't even taking those on.
If they bring up Double-A hitter Michael Conforto, is that just a desperation move?
Yes. And I think, he's a really impressive young hitter. And when I talk to scouts, they have great things to say about him and what he's going to be in the future. But just having covered teams in New York for a long time, I cringe at the idea that they would do that. He's got fewer than 50 games above Class A, and he's going to be treated by idiots like me as if he's the next Darryl Strawberry. He's the savior for this lineup that's been so bad, and it's the sort of pressure cooker that you don't want to put any young player in. And you wish that there were more support because, rightly or wrongly, there would be so much scrutiny on his performance, and you just would hope that it wouldn't be some kind of a setback.
John Smoltz saying that this rotation for the Mets is way, way better than the one of the 90s Braves. How would it compare to rotations that we've seen in the postseason in recent years if the Mets could just make it to October?
Well, stuff-wise, you know exactly what he's saying, and I'm assuming that was the context of what he was talking about. He certainly wasn't talking about actually what it's accomplished, because Glavine and Maddox and he did so much.
Correct.
But stuff-wise, wow. It just jumps off the screen when you're watching them on television, and it looks like they're overwhelming every single hitter, and I'm sure that's got Smoltz's attention. And one thing about my conversation with John in the past about October and what wins then, he always believed that power pitching was what did the trick in October. And, he lived it. And I think that as great as that Atlanta rotation was, when they got into October, the fact that Glavine and Maddox didn't miss bats as much as some other teams, eventually or sometimes became an issue. And the Mets, if they got into October, they would be such a dangerous team, which is part of the reason why you're sitting here watching this going, please do something.
Man. Buster, the Athletics today traded Scott Kazmir to the Houston Astros. How legitimate is Houston now?
Oh, absolutely legitimate. And Armen, I don't think they're done. I think they're going to be doing some other things. I know they're poking around on some other starting pitchers. I tend to believe that they'll stay in the conversations, for example, for someone like Johnny Cueto. But it's a dynamic team, and nobody's more dynamic than their new shortstop, Carlos Correa, who has gotten off to such a great start. In fact, I think you could make an argument that right now he's already the best shortstop in the American League. The other day I was talking with a longtime coach in the American League, and I knew that he had seen the Astros, and I asked him, hey, who does Carlos Correa remind you of? And he hesitated for about 0.1 second, and he goes, Alex Rodriguez when he was with Seattle. And I talked to a scout last night, and I asked him, I said, so what are you seeing in Correa? And he goes, oh, my God, that guy's a beast. And when you can start with that, as we've seen with the Angels and Mike Trout, you have a player that good hitting right in the middle of your order, you can certainly be in a position where you can accomplish a lot of things. And now that they have Dallas Keuchel and Lance McCullers, along with Scott Kazmir in the rotation, that's pretty dangerous, and they certainly have put pressure on other teams now to answer some of what they did here with the addition of Kazmir.
And Buster, they're such a young team, but if you're saying there's a good chance they're going to make more moves, do they feel like this could already be their year?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Well, shoot, they're in the playoff race. And,
Absolutely.
they led the American League West for most of this season. And there's no reason to think that they, can't continue at least be a factor in the wild card race as well as the Angels are playing.
Buster Olney thanks to Buffalo Wild Wings, and today on his insider blog at ESPN.com, he has a complete onslaught of different possibilities and trade rumors going on. Buster, what could possibly happen over these next 8 days as we look at the deadline that fascinates you the most?
Well, besides the scenario with the Yankees and the closers, it will be interesting to see what the Detroit Tigers do with David Price because, look, they're 47-47 going into play on Thursday. They are definitely trending downward. The rotation has been absolutely terrible outside of David Price. Their bullpen has been terrible this year. And I think anybody with a clear-eyed view would say this is not really a playoff team. But here's the thing. The two wild cards bring so much hope into the equation, and the Tigers are a win-now organization. And so you got to figure there's a chance that they'll just ride this out and keep Price, and it's going to be a difficult decision. But on July 29th of last year, the Kansas City Royals were 53-52, one game over 500, and they were 3.5 games out of the wild card race. As of me talking to you today, the Tigers are 3 games out of the wild card race. So you would understand why the Tigers or other teams are waiting before they're ready to blow up, their playoff chances.
So the last 24 hours of the trade deadline could be as crazy as last year?
I don't think so. I don't think there's as many buyers as there have been in the past. I do think there are going to be a flurry of trades, and everyone's going to be watching to see if the Phillies are finally going to pull the trigger on a Cole Hamels trade. I don't like the way it's trending for them unless they work out some sort of a deal with the Dodgers.
Buster, an hour and a half away from here this weekend, Cooperstown Hall of Fame induction weekend, Smoltz, Martinez, Johnson, Biggio. What's your biggest takeaway on this group?
That you're talking about in the case of Pedro Martinez, in the case of Randy Johnson, you're talking about two of the all-time greats. I think if you were to drop a list of the top 5 left-handed starters of all time, Randy Johnson would be in that mix. And what we saw Pedro Martinez accomplish in the late 90s, 2000, 2001, when he was with the Red Sox, was incredible. And I think that over time we're gaining more appreciation for it because we have a greater understanding of, just how much steroids affected the game. And if you can post an ERA under 2 in the American League during the steroid era and dominate the way that he did, he had to be pretty special. And I'll always remember, of course, I got to see all those guys do so many great things in person, but Pedro Martinez's 17 strikeout game at Yankee Stadium against a team that had won 125 games the year before, that was a one-hitter with no walks. That was the greatest game I think I'll ever see pitched in my lifetime.
Buster Olney, he's the best. His blog at ESPN.com, couple bucks a month, become an insider. It's over the top, more than worth it. Buster, you're going to be on the grind over the next week or so. Have fun, man. We'll be keeping an eye on you, and we'll do it again next Thursday.
Thanks, Armen.